Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. A lot to get to this morning. First of all, the poll that we teased relentlessly yesterday, big New York Times, their last look at the Senate races heading into Election Day. Some favorable numbers for Democrats, but recall last time around, New York Times had some favorable numbers for Democrats in 2020 that didn't exactly pan out. So we'll get into all of that. Also, we have some updates out of Ukraine. Zelensky concerned about the Republican positioning in terms of not just military aid, but specifically continued economic aid to that country. So we'll break that down for you. New insights into potential plans from Elon Musk and Twitter, maybe bringing back Vine. Interesting move.
It's happening, people. It's happening.
Actually, my daughter, when she was little, she loved Vine.
Vine was cool. We'll get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also, it looks like affirmative action is kind of on its last legs. Arguments in front of the Supreme Court yesterday, the conservative majority seemed very skeptical of its continued constitutionality. So we'll break that down for you. And we have even more details about the Paul Pelosi hammer attack. The accused assailant himself spoke yesterday. We have some details that are quite shocking, in fact, so we'll get into all of that. Saagar is looking further at Twitter and their business model and some potential trouble ahead. I'm taking a look at cable news and their business model and whether they are dying or already dead. We also have Dr. Vinay Prasad on to give us an update on vaccines. But we wanted to start with the midterms as we are coming down the stretch here next week. Tuesday, it's happening. It's already upon us. So this is the New York Times last look at the key Senate battleground races. Let's put this up on the screen and you can see what the overall numbers are here in Arizona. That is where the Democrats, according to this New York Times Siena poll, have the largest lead, +6 for Mark Kelly over Blake Masters. John Fetterman, according to them, still holding on to a decent lead here. It says +6, but in my, I think I'm doing the math right when I say 49 minus 44 is 5. Then we have Warnock and Walker, 49-46, so that is +3 for the Dem. Cortez Masto and Laxalt in Nevada, that one they have even. So pretty close, but much more slightly more favorable numbers for Democrats than we have been seeing recently. If you dig into this poll, go ahead and put the next tear sheet up on the screen. This is their write-up of it. They say, and I think this is an accurate assessment of kind of where we are. Senate control hinges on neck-and-neck races. The contests are close in Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. Many voters want Republicans to flip the Senate, but they prefer the Democrat in their state. And that's that macro-micro dynamic that we've been talking about the whole time. If you look at the macro numbers, if you look at the economy, if you look at how people feel about the economy, if you look at Biden's approval rating, if you look at right track, wrong track, if you look like we did yesterday at the number of people who say the country's out of control, you would say, this is going to be a Republican landslide year. But then when you look at the individual candidates, you see that in every single one of these instances in these key battleground states, these candidates, the Republican side, are upside down in terms of approval ratings. So people don't really like the candidates. Overall, they would prefer Republican control. Which thing ends up winning out? They break down a few of these races in a way that is pretty interesting. So Mark Kelly in Arizona beating Mr. Biden's approval rating by 15 points, winning nearly 1/4 of the people who disapprove of Mr. Biden's job performance in the state. All of these candidates are actually outpacing Biden on his approval rating. So there's a question, is that sustainable? Right. Can that really hold when it comes to Election Day? In Georgia, you have questions about the character of Herschel Walker. Nearly half of all Georgia voters view Warnock as more honest and trustworthy, while only 37% of voters rate Mr. Walker the same. So again, on this question of candidate quality, is that the factor that ultimately determines the race in Georgia, or is it these big top-line numbers? And in Arizona, there was one thing that was a little bit unique about the race there, and potentially why Mark Kelly is actually doing better than the other Democratic candidates, according to this poll and actually a lot of other polls. In every other single one of these states, voters say that the economy is the most important issue. In Arizona alone, cultural issues have a slight edge over the economy. And there have been some fierce battles in that state over what the future of reproductive rights are going to be there. So it kind of makes sense that that would have additional resonance in that state. And I think that's a big part of why you see Mark Kelly doing pretty well against Blake Masters pretty consistently in polls.
Mark Kelly is a strong candidate. I mean, he doesn't keep a national profile. He actually speaks out against Biden on the border almost consistently in every single time that he does give a speech and in the debate. So look, I mean, that's what individuality and regionality can give you. I think it will be the true and ultimate test of quote unquote candidate quality versus national trends. I do think though that we owe it to people to just show you that this poll exact one in 2020 was not the most accurate thing. So let's go ahead and put the next thing up there on the screen. So you can see here, this is the New York Times Siena poll from basically the exact same time period, October 26th to 31st of 2020. So for the presidential election in Pennsylvania, the Times had Biden at 6 points up. The election margin, Biden won by 1.2, so that's a miss of 4.8, which means that if you were to factor in the exact same thing, that the same poll is tied between Fetterman and
Right.
Oz.
Fetterman is up 5 right now in their poll, and they had basically a 5-point miss last time around. So as tight as it could be.
50-50. All right, so Senate in Arizona, same, actually, exact same candidate, Mark Kelly, so we could presume a little bit there. Mark Kelly was up by 7, according to the New York Times. He won by 2.3 with a 4.7% miss, which means it's effectively tied in that. I guess Kelly would get there
a little bit of an
1
edge.
point.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at Nevada, they had Biden up by 6. Biden won by 2.4. So that means it's a 3.6% miss, which actually, that means that Laxalt, if you factor in the same thing, would be winning. And actually, some of the details that I looked at, Krystal, and I know it gets sketchy in terms of who gets polled and whether they're overweighted or not.
Right.
Let's just assume this, which we have. The Siena and the Times have not made any major changes to their methodology from 2020.
Right.
From what I read.
Which is the information that we have available to us.
That's what we have available to us. Well, then I would presume that the miss would be relatively consistent with 2020 and with 2016. So when you consider that, I would probably be the Republican candidate in every single one of these races. Just except maybe
I would say
in
except
Pennsylvania.
Arizona.
See, I don't know. I think Pennsylvania is tighter.
Arizona, I mean, first of all, there was Kelly has a larger margin, and the miss was about the same as Pennsylvania, but he does have a little bit of a larger margin. I think one thing that is interesting about Arizona, like I was saying, is that the social cultural issues seem to be weighing more heavily on voters there than in other places. And Mark Kelly was the only one of the Democratic candidates in any of these Senate contests who is actually winning voters without a college degree.
Right.
So he sort of stands alone on that metric. And then Blake Masters, as we covered previously, who's obviously the Republican nominee, he said some really extreme out there things on abortion during the primary that he's since tried to soft pedal and walk back. But I mean, he already said it. It's being run in ads. And so if social cultural issues are more of a factor there than they are in other states, it makes sense to me that Mark Kelly would be in a slightly better position than some of these other candidates. And then when you add to that, he has a very solid identity and persona in the state. People have known him for a long time. So he has, high favorability ratings. Blake Masters has low favorability ratings. So I think that one is probably the best bet for Democrats.
There was interesting news, though, this morning. The Libertarian candidate dropped out and actually endorsed Blake Masters. Did a podcast with him. He was only polling at like 2 or 3%.
Yeah, but
when
hey, if it's close, it can make a difference.
It could certainly make a difference. So that was one in his favor. At the same time, there was that other independent candidate in Pennsylvania who also was polling at like 1 or 2%, something like that, who dropped out and endorsed John Fetterman. So again, when it's 50-50, it's a game of literally of inches. So you never know who exactly is going to pull this out and whether those things could make the difference. But it does also eliminate any future case of like spoiler or anything. It's like, no, this is a true up and down contest in both. Let's find out.
Republicans
It'll be
don't
fun.
whine about that shit the way that Democrats do.
Yeah, you're definitely correct. Well, I don't know. I'm trying to think. Yeah, you're right. I think
really
that there
can't
are states,
think of Republicans like complaining about spoilers in the same way.
I think there are states where if Gary Johnson or Joe Jorgensen hadn't been on the ballot, that Trump likely would have won, like Georgia and in Arizona. But you're right. I don't see Trump and the National Republican Party being like, Joe Jorgensen is a spoiler.
We were wrong,
they're just like, well, I mean, they do think they're wrong, but not by Joe
they
Jorgensen.
made up a different reason.
Correct.
Like, that one might have actually had more salience than the nonsense that they ultimately invented. Okay, putting all that aside, let's put this next piece up on the screen because I do think that this is interesting, which is Biden's approval rating in each state is really, really bad. In Arizona, he has only a 36% approval rating, which makes it even more remarkable that Mark Kelly seems to be holding up pretty well in these polls. You've got in Nevada, 38% approval rating. This is a state, these are all states that he won. Georgia, 39% approval rating. Pennsylvania, he's doing the best, 42% approval rating. And that's the state where the Democratic candidate is sort of outperforming him by the smallest number. You have Mark Kelly running 15 points ahead of Biden's approval, Warnock plus 10, Catherine Cortez Masto plus 9, and Fetterman plus 7. So Biden really weighing down Democratic chances. I just don't think there's any denying that at this point, given his lack of popularity and the fact that these Democrats are able to, at this point, apparently outperform where he sits in terms of his approval rating, is a testament. I don't know if it's such a testament to the Democratic candidates or their messaging as it is to the very poor quality of the Republican candidates and some of the nervousness about electing them.
Yeah, don't know. I would personally bet, an interesting thing right now, Krystal, is there's a narrative kind of on the Democratic side that Republican pollsters are flooding the zone in order to
Yeah, I saw that yesterday, yeah.
But then somebody made a great point where it's like, if you think the Democratic groups aren't also polling, they're just not releasing their polls. And so the limited amounts of, there was a group like Democracy Corp or whatever, one of the few Democratic groups to actually release it. They had Republicans up by 5 on the generic ballot in their latest one. So I think that if the Democratic groups had polls to release, which would be good for them, they would release it to kind of quote unquote flood the zone in the same way. It's not like individual candidates and all those others all don't have. I mean, look at John Fetterman. The guy's got millions of dollars in the bank. Super PACs are banking all of these, to the tune of over $1 billion. So I think that there's plenty of Democratic polling. They're probably just not releasing it because it's not good. I just want to say that for those who might be buying this, GOP is flooding the zone. I'm like, well, they're flooding the zone because the polls are good for them. And if they had counter ones that, look, this is also part of the issue with averages, with, considering polls like what group, what not, et cetera. And that's why part of why I'm just looking is looking at the record of the ones that we do have and be like, okay, well, in this even in the quote unquote independents, average miss of 5, especially in many of these states. So just factor that in.
Yeah, I mean, 538, which I think most people would say if it's biased, it's more in a liberal direction, has the Senate at 50-50 right now.
Yeah, there you go.
And if you want to make a case for why Democrats might outperform, which I do think the outcome of this election is genuinely uncertain. We live in very chaotic times. People are voting in patterns that they haven't before, mail-in, all this stuff. Voting is different than it ever has been before. There's clearly extremely high interest. So if you wanted to make a case for Democrats are going to outperform, I think the case would be they've been turning out in a very strong way in the early vote. I would personally discount all of the early vote numbers because that doesn't always pan out the way that you think it's going to. But anyway, that would be the case. They're turning out very strongly in terms of the early vote. We had those special elections where they outperformed. You have young voters who maybe are showing up in higher numbers than pollsters ultimately expect. That would be ultimately what you are banking on. I mean, it doesn't hurt the fact that gas prices have been going down a little bit. So, maybe that helps Democrats a tiny bit here down the stretch. But, it continues to me to be a question of candidate quality, like micro, regional, state-based trends versus overall national mood. Which one of those things ends up being the most important? My theory of politics generally is that, the maxim used to be all politics is local. Now I think all politics is national. So do I think candidate quality makes a difference at all? A little, yeah, I think it makes somewhat of a difference. Do I think it's going to be determinative in each of these races? That I start to be really, really skeptical of.
Yep.
The race that we have probably focused the most on, and I think the national media has as well, and I think for some good reason, is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, right now, that seat is held by a Republican. So if Democrats are able to pick that one up, that makes the Republican task a little bit harder. They have to be able to pick off one of these other states in order to be able to secure their Senate majority. Biden and Obama obviously see the state as key as well. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. They are planning to campaign together in Philadelphia on Saturday. I did a whole thing yesterday on Obama back out on the campaign trail, and also the notable lack of Biden on the campaign trail, which has been very different from his predecessors. You know, even Obama back in 2010, when he was under a lot of fire and his approval rating was similarly not great, he was out there on the campaign trail. Of course, Trump loves doing rallies. He'll do them every chance he possibly gets. So, of course, he did a lot of campaigning and is doing a fair amount of campaigning for Republican candidates this time as well. Biden has not done much at all. And in fact, one of the places he went was a little strange. He went to Florida to back up Charlie Crist, who's like in a doomed race against Ron DeSantis. So I was like, okay, I don't know why you're spending your time doing that, but whatever. He's done some Zoom events, but this will really be, you know, the big marquee event. I think Biden still thinks he's got that like Scranton Joe Pennsylvania touch. They clearly see Pennsylvania as central to their chances. They clearly understand Fetterman is, you know, kind of on the rocks or on the ropes, that his polling has been sliding here down the stretch. And so they, you know, want to go and see what they can do to garner as much enthusiasm among the Democratic base as possible and urge them to turn out at the last minute.
Yeah, I mean, I question whether it's, I mean, here's the issue with Obama. He has never shown any capability at actually transferring his own personal popularity to Democratic victory.
Yes.
2010, 2012, 2016. I've done several monologues, I think, playing that last clip of him from the 2016 election where he's like, this, you know, X is on the ballot. I'm on the ballot. I may not, my name might not be on there. I'm on the ballot. And he asked me, he took it to the American people. He said, you need to vote as if my name. And it's like, well, they did. So, you know, it didn't turn out to work out so well. So he might be a popular figure amongst Democrats. But again, we have reams of data to tell us that he has never once been able to transfer his personal popularity.
Yeah.
On Biden, it's a negative popularity. He's underwater by almost 2/3 in the state of Pennsylvania for his approval rating. If I was Fetterman, I wouldn't even want to look on the same stage as him. I was actually surprised, in one of the few moments like it was kind of clear out of the Fetterman debate, is remember they asked him, they're like, would you support Joe Biden for president? And he said, if he chooses to run again, I would support him 100%.
Well, Pennsylvania of the swing states is the one where Biden continues to have the highest approval rating. Now, it's low. It's 42%.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I think that's the reason why, if he was going to go to any of these states, he would think that Pennsylvania was the spot. And like I said, I think, you know, he has this self-image, self-conception of like Scranton Joe and in touch with the working class and the white working class in particular. So they're going to Philadelphia with the thought of, you know, we'll really turn out the Philadelphia, like the urban core and the suburban vote that is increasingly, you know, what Democrats rely on. And then at the same time, Trump is going to be doing, on that same day on Saturday, a rally in the western part of Pennsylvania, which is a place, you know, he feels like is really behind him and where people, you know, turned out that hadn't turned out in a long time to vote for him in 2016 and in 2020 again. It's kind of a potential preview, potential little 2024 preview. And I think the expectation is, you know, Trump may announce his presidential run fairly quickly after the midterms. We'll see. Biden will probably get in after the holidays. So this may be a little bit of a preview of the presidential race, that the rematch that no one wants, but we're probably going to get anyway, that one. That's what we're going to get a preview of this weekend. There were some interesting numbers, Saagar. I'm curious what you make of them. In that New York Times Siena poll about Pennsylvania and how people feel about Fetterman's health in particular, you had a plurality of voters saying Fetterman was not healthy enough to do the job after the debate Wednesday night. So most of their calls happened before the debate.
Right.
And overall, only a little over a third said he's not healthy enough to perform the duties of the job. It's very partisan. Republicans, a majority, 71% have concerns about his health. Well, they weren't voting for him anyway. Majority of Democrats, 83%, say he is healthy enough to do the job. But there does seem to have been somewhat of a shift. So it's still not a majority, but a plurality, they say, in the calls they made after the debate, now expressing concerns about his health.
Look, I wish it would matter. I just don't think it does. I really don't. And I'll tell you why, which is that a lot of these Dems, highly partisan Dems, they were going to vote anyway. You know, most of these people not even vote anyway. They probably already voted, early voting. You know, Pennsylvania and the way that the mail-in ballots and all that have been working, most of that has been sent in. Republicans, they were going to turn out against. At best, it might have an impact on day of vote. to the extent that that matters. We are actually, unfortunately, seeing major polarization in America on how people vote. Many Republicans are dragging themselves to the polls in person on election day, specifically because they've been told they can no longer trust mail-in balloting. So is it going to really impact the way that people vote on election day? Of course, I'm not a psychologist. I have no idea how these things are going to play. In general, I think that his position on crime or his ties to Joe Biden on the stage are going to matter tenfold more than the actual.
That's always. This is the candidate quality on the Democratic side question, right? And to be honest with you, and I've said this before, Herschel Walker, with all his issues and his lies and the hypocrisy and all of that, I understand if you're someone who's like, no, abortion is my issue, so I really don't care if he's, has CTE or whatever issues or is a liar or whatever. Like, he's going to vote the way I want him to vote, and I want Republicans to be in control. I don't think that is. That makes some sense to me. Like, I don't think that is illogical. And I think it's the same thing with Fetterman here. It's going to be much more, and this is ultimately, except for in this one instance, this is ultimately better for Republicans. I don't think that candidate quality is as important as whatever the national mood ultimately is, which is why I continue to think that Democrats are likely in for a rough night. But I just want to couch all of it in saying, I really don't know. Yeah. I'm just so humble at this point about making any predictions of how this is all going to unfold. We've seen so many polling misses. We live in such chaotic times. It's just really hard to analyze any of these races with any level of certainty about what is ultimately going to happen. So listen, going back to the beginning, New York Times has polls that look pretty decent for Democrats. You factor in the misses from last time around, and you basically, once again, have a total jump ball for the Senate. And so I think that's basically where we are.
There, I concur. Look, if I had to bet, I'd put money on the Republicans. That being said, been wrong a lot. Elections are crazy. Americans have a way of always surprising us on election day. Mm-hmm. That's honestly why I love covering it.
Yeah.
Anytime you'll cover it and you see returns out of South Texas for Trump, and you're like, holy shit, it's like one of those things where you're like, I didn't think this was possible. Yeah. It's cool that it is. I love living here.
By the way, we are going to be doing live election night coverage here. So stay tuned for details on that. We'll have, it'll be us, Ryan and Emily will be here, Saagar, you are Saagar, Kyle and Marshall.
The full crew is here.
My other co-hosts will all be on deck here to analyze whatever the hell happens that night. So it should be fun regardless of the outcome.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, let's talk about Ukraine. So some interesting things that are happening on the domestic front with regards to Ukraine. We covered previously how GOP lawmakers had said that they would see a tough time passing new aid to Ukraine, specifically military aid by Kevin McCarthy. He said that the American people can no longer have a blank check for Ukraine. He was quickly, however, rebuked by Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who was like, no, we're going to do anything that we want for Ukraine. So there's a little bit of war going on. There's three camps is how I would describe it. McCarthy is under pressure, not from people who are skeptical of the war, but of the fiscal hawks who are like, hey, we shouldn't be doing $50 billion. And actually current indications are that Democrats are going to try and pass another $60 billion in aid for Ukraine in order to preempt all of this. That would bring it to $110 billion, which is, as I have read, more than any foreign aid to any country ever, especially in a military conflict, on par right now with South Vietnam in the middle of the Vietnam War. Just to put it in context. Anyway,
but it's not a proxy war, guys.
Right. Anyway, so there's the fiscal people. Then there's people kind of like us, probably the smallest contingent of maybe 5 to 10 lawmakers at best in the House of Representatives who are like, hey, maybe we should do something else. We contingent this aid on diplomacy, etc. Then there's the third camp, which are the McConnell folks who are like, no, we're not having no question, no debates. We're going to give Ukraine anything it possibly could want. Anyway, let's put this up there on the screen. So Ukraine is now telling the GOP that, quote, it can't just be about guns. I found this really fascinating, which is that Ukrainian leaders believe, despite notes from some on the far right, that the GOP won't skimp on giving Kyiv military aid. In fact, Ukraine expects even more robust weapons packages if Republicans are in charge. That is according to their own lobbyist here in Washington. The Ukrainians are, though, more concerned about Republicans paring back future economic aid to the country. And this is something I've actually tried to emphasize here a little bit, which is that, look, the war is the war. But, Ukraine as an economic polity basically does not exist without the United States. We pay all their bills, balancing their budget, effectively backstopping their currency, making sure that they can buy things on the global market. All of that is because of U.S. Treasury aid. And actually, the United States has given the vast majority of economic aid to Ukraine. So it's actually interesting because one of the critiques I had seen, and this I could see really landing with some GOP officials, was when Rand Paul and others were like, we're balancing Ukraine's budget before we balance our own. Now, I don't even necessarily believe in a balanced budget on the federal level, but what I'm telling people is that attack line actually could quite well land with the GOP caucus. They've never had a trouble of writing blank checks to military aid, right? But on this, the Ukrainians are probably correct to think, hey, this could be a real problem for us because, if you think inflation is bad here in Ukraine, it's like nobody even really knows. 30, 40%. It's a classic wartime economy. Their budgets are a mess. Their own currency itself is effectively like completely backstopped by the Federal Reserve and the U.S. economic system. So the point being that if they lose some of that, it actually could cause major problems for them on their ability to buy weapons and other things out on the global market, even to denominate different ways their transactions for grain, etc. From what I've read, it could be a serious problem. Anyway, it's interesting to me that the Ukrainian government, they're relatively confident they're going to get their weapons, but they're like, no, we really need the economic aid to keep this thing going too.
Because they don't just have Zelensky arguing for the weapons; they have all the weapons manufacturers also lobby. That's where the real divide goes. Why are the Republicans so anxious and willing to send military aid but reluctant on economic aid? Well, they're getting campaign contributions from all of the military-industrial complex, so they have a big political incentive to continue moving in that direction. And then if they withhold the economic aid, they get to play, virtuousness on the fiscal front. And there is a real populist message that I think just doesn't just land with the Republican base, but land with a lot of Americans of like, oh, Jackson, Mississippi doesn't even have clean water, and yet we're, shipping all of this aid, no strings attached, to the Ukrainians indefinitely, writing them a blank check.
Right.
So I do think, as we've been saying, as we get into winter, as inflation continues to bite, as this thing goes on and on with no real end in sight, as some of the failures of the U.S. policy and the NATO policy up to this point become more and more manifest, I think there's going to be an increasing political audience for that type of messaging. And at the same time, there's increasing reports the Biden administration is kind of frustrated with Zelensky and sees him as kind of like ungrateful for the overwhelming support that we've been providing. There were some indications of that actually in the Politico article that we just had up. They said early in the conflict, Zelensky urged the U.S. to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, but Biden, of course, declined. More recently, he's called on Biden to formally declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. And they are sort of frustrated with, although they understand that Zelensky is just trying to look out for his own national interests, and I think we all get that, there's a frustration with the amount of aid that we've sent and then the continued escalation of public demands from Zelensky. That apparently broke out into the open on a phone call back in June. According to a report, let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. Apparently, Biden lost his temper. He got grumpy old man with Zelensky in a June phone call when the Ukrainian leader asked for more aid. And the context here is they say Biden had barely finished telling Zelensky he just greenlighted another $1 billion in U.S. military assistance for Ukraine when Zelensky already started listing all the additional help that he needed and wasn't getting. Biden lost his temper. People familiar with the call said American people were being quite generous, and his administration, the U.S. military, were working hard to help Ukraine, he said, raising his voice, and Zelensky could show a little more gratitude. It's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. I think everyone almost certainly expects that the Senate may be a little bit of a dicier proposition, but Republicans are almost certain to be in control of the House. And the House is actually where you have more dissent in the Republican caucus in terms of the direction on Ukraine aid. So there's a possibility here that this could be some sort of negotiating leverage for Biden, where he can play a kind of good cop, bad cop of like, of course, I want to continue supporting you, but I got to deal with these Republicans in Congress and they have different views about this. It could, in a sense, strengthen his hand if he wants it to.
See, I just don't think so, because I think the Dems will just give him $60 billion beforehand. They'll just pre-appropriate it.
But we see how fast they ripped through that.
Well, they haven't even spent most of that. A lot of it, I think more than half of it has not even yet been dispersed. So they're effectively just going to write. Remember how and this has always been my problem with the aid, which is that I don't have any problem giving the Ukrainians military aid, But I think that a lot of it should be constrained by the People's Congress and by some goals for what exactly we want in Ukraine. So, for example, I don't think any aid should go to Ukraine if they're going to use it to maybe bomb a bridge in Crimea, or maybe launch an airstrike on Crimea with a U.S.-provided weapon.
Or bomb a Russian civilian on their own soil.
You want to do that and get into a war by yourself, you be my guest, but you're not going to do it with the stuff that we give you. And so that's always been my issue, which is that none of this is preconditioned. And unfortunately, the way that, and I read this, if people will remember the last time that supplemental aid passed, I read through those provisions where it just says to the President of the United States up until 2025 may disperse that as well to the country of Ukraine. That's the issue, which is that, and again, remember, look, Biden could drop dead tomorrow. You want Kamala to have $68 billion to play with, to give whatever she wants to the Ukrainians? You should ask yourself that question.
Yeah.
Same with Trump, just so everybody knows. I mean, you know, Trump is exactly a yo-yo on Ukraine. He's constantly either we should nuke Russia or the other way. All of this aid, just so people will be aware, would be completely at the disposal of the commander-in-chief of the United States for whomever holds that office.
You know, it was interesting. I was looking at some of this polling last week, and in the early phases of the conflict, the critique coming from Republicans, including Trump, and really led in certain ways by Trump, was that the Biden administration wasn't doing enough. They weren't shipping enough weapons. They weren't doing the no-fly zone. They weren't being hawkish enough. Now, as you said, that's sort of yo-yoed to what I consider to be a better position of, you know, we can't do this forever. We need to have preconditions. I mean, in the best of their critiques, some of their critiques are a little bit off the mark, but in the best of their critiques, it's like, hold up, let's have a little bit of let's have some accountability about where this is all going. That could just as easily yo-yo right back to they're not doing enough and we need to ship more weapons. And in fact, that's where all of the center of gravity really pulls you in Washington, D.C. That's the easiest case to make. All of the cable news networks, but especially CNN and Fox News, are all primed to make that argument. It's frankly, at this point with the American people, given the way that the war, you know, has been, like the lack of education on the war and the potential consequences that has occurred with the U.S. media, it'd be easier to make that case to the American people, ultimately, given where their emotions are right now. So it's just as easy to see the Lindsey Grahams and the Mitch McConnells of the world winning out the argument and having the Republican base led by Republican leadership saying, no, 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 we need to do more. We need to give them the longer range missiles. We need to be all in, especially when it comes to weapons. So I don't put that off the table whatsoever.
You shouldn't put it off the table. We already had a redux of this. It's called 2014 and then 2018. So what happened? So brief history lesson. Barack Obama gets savaged by John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and many other people, Mike Pompeo, and others for not shipping Javelin missiles to Ukraine. And they're like, you need to give him Javelins. And Obama was like, no, I'm not going to do it. He does a major spread with Jeffrey Goldberg where he says, at the end of the day, I'm roughly quoting him here. He says, at the end of the day, Ukraine will always be a core interest for Russia. It's not a core interest for us. And if people want us to go to war with Russia, they should say that, because I don't believe that we should. Very different rhetoric pre-Russiagate. Trump comes into office despite all of this, oh, I want a Russian reset, etc. He abandons that at a policy level, caves to Mike Pompeo, the Lindsey Grahams of the world, immediately starts shipping Javelins over to Ukraine. And look, I mean, accelerated the civil war almost certainly to the point of where it is. I'm not saying that's the sole cause. I'm saying it was obviously some factor in what happened over there. So we have had that play out. It is not a guarantee that they don't do that. And in fact, it's very possible, as they said, that they could pass even more demanding things through Congress, telling Biden that he has to ship certain weapon systems to Ukraine if the aid does want to get signed by the commander-in-chief. So look, it's a jump ball on how exactly it all goes. And I don't want anyone to come away with the idea that, you know, if the Republicans take control, this is going to change the situation on the ground. I actually think it's probably the opposite, as you said. Overwhelming pressure. I've said a lot of controversial things in my life. I don't think people have ever been more angry with me than when I question the Ukraine consensus, just so everybody is aware.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, you saw what happened to the progressives when they tiptoed barely into that water.
The difference is I don't give a shit.
Right. That is the difference. And you have a little tiny bit of a backbone, unlike them, that are just total mushes, with the exception of Ro Khanna, who I do want to give credit to.
Correct. All right, so let's move on, though, to the next part, because there's some weird stuff going on. And let's put this on the screen. Norway actually has put its military on a raised alert level in response to the Ukraine war. Now, obviously, the question is, why? Why now? It actually gets back to the Nord Stream pipeline and to increasing worries whenever we are thinking about energy infrastructure across Europe as it continues to get colder. So here's what they said, quote, "This is the most severe security situation in several decades. There There are no indications that Russia is expanding its war to other countries, but increased tensions make us more exposed to threats, intelligence operations, and influence campaigns. He continued to emphasize there is no reason to believe that Russia will invade Norway or any other country, quote, directly, but we must be more vigilant. I don't believe ordinary people will notice any change. The reason why is that A, Norway is currently seeking to bring a new fleet of U.S. submarine hunting patrol aircraft into regular operations in its territory, because people should remember that at the very same day, actually, that the Nord Stream pipeline, whatever happened to it, that Norway actually had inaugurated a new pipeline from the Baltic Sea, which was specifically designed and being sold by European policymakers as the new energy lifeline outside of the Russian influence sphere. The problem, obviously, is that Russians and nobody, military planner on earth, is stupid and can look at that pipeline and say, that looks like a real nice target for me. Whomever would want to, sabotage that, change the situation. It's a very, very single point of failure, which could have tremendous consequences. I was reading a very interesting article yesterday. I had talked about, I was like, Europe's probably going to be fine because they do have a lot of natural gas stock, all of that. What my mistake was is I was thinking about it in the current infrastructure. I was not factoring in that if they do lose this pipeline, if they do lose a couple of key pieces of energy infrastructure, you're actually back in the dark ages, effectively. Then you are talking about 30, 40% cuts across the board. So the issue across Norway and a lot of this area is they are home to a significant oil and gas infrastructure, which is not just powering them, but powering the entire continent. It also comes on the heels of a really weird report out of Finnish media. Let's put this up there on the screen. Thought that we owed it all of you to discuss it, which is that nuclear weapons could be, and I want to emphasize, could be positioned in Finland if the country's application to NATO is approved. This is according to a major Finnish newspaper. So remember, Finland and Sweden have submitted applications to join NATO in May after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, according to the major Helsinki-based newspaper, which I am not going to try and pronounce, regarding NATO membership, they will possibly, again, before Parliament, does not include any opt-outs in the script for nuclear weapons deployed on their territory.
The assumption is basically if you're in NATO, you're accepting this, the potential of nuclear weapons being placed on your territory, and they did not say that we don't want that. It hasn't been part of their negotiations.
So there are no restrictions right now also on establishing NATO bases in the country. So you could read this two ways, which is one, you could say they're keeping the door open for the immediate term. Two, which is they'd be fools to rule it out. Because, you never know what's going to happen. You maybe want to be in a situation. Anyway, it caused a little bit of a stir in Finland, whatever, because they have debates over there too. People shouldn't forget it wasn't really until Ukraine that a lot of Finns did not want to be in NATO. They were like, no, we don't see any point. No, what's the point of antagonizing Russia? But then after that, they were like, okay, screw it. Part of why, by the way, the Russian invasion was such a strategic disaster.
Right.
To turn effectively neutral populations who have literally fought wars against you and said, no, we're out. We don't want even to have the chance of this. The point is that a lot of eyes right now on U.S. nukes deployed across Europe. Nobody exactly knows where they all are. We know that we've got some in Belgium and Germany and Italy and the Netherlands and in Turkey. We don't know whether we are still considering what the Polish prime minister had asked for, which is he wanted nuclear weapons directly in his country. The Finns, I guess, keeping the door open. All of this just points to it's still a precarious security situation. We may not be talking about missiles raining down on Kyiv, although, low-grade attacks on their critical energy infrastructure continues every single day in the war. So just because it isn't that major missile rain down thing that we saw a couple of days ago doesn't mean that the war isn't continuing and that the people in the region are not preparing for a possible escalation in the event of some, insane event. So look, nobody thought Nord Stream was going to happen, and then that happened. So we have no idea what the next move could be.
Well, and whoever is behind the Nord Stream sabotage, Putin used it to say, oh, we see that it's okay now. You've set the precedent. Because they're, of course, blaming, the U.S. and NATO. maybe they're right, maybe they're not. But they're using it to say, oh, you've set the precedent that we can strike critical infrastructure, and we've seen what they've been doing on the ground in Ukraine. So that's part of the nervousness here. There was one other piece of news that I noted this morning that I wanted to make sure to bring to you guys, which is that Putin is now officially saying that the partial mobilization of citizens to fight in their war against Ukraine has ended. Obviously, that provoked, huge backlash domestically, and really, in a sense, it was a very psychological turning point for the Russian population, because up to that point, all of the efforts had been to insulate most of the Russian population from what was happening in Ukraine, to have basically business as usual, go about their day, don't worry about what we're doing over here. And this was really a ripping of the Band-Aid off of that trajectory. It was just no longer feasible if they were going to continue to have any kind of a shot in this war ultimately, that some hundreds of thousands, we don't really know, of military-age men fled the country to avoid this draft mobilization. There's no guarantees that this will be the end or that they won't do another draft, but at least for now, what he is saying is that the partial mobilization has been completed.
Yeah, makes sense. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one. This is something which I love. Let's put this up there on the screen. Some major news after Elon has bought Twitter. Elon has ordered the team of engineers to revive the Vine code and reboot the app sometime this year. So people may not remember, Vine actually was shuttered in 2016 after it was acquired by Twitter in 2012. It's really interesting. What a lot of Twitter engineers are saying is that the old code base, quote, needs a lot of work because it hasn't been updated
been a few years,
in 6 years. And it's not really built for, but I mean, not only like modern platforms, but if you just think about how much social media has changed in the last 6 years with the emergence of TikTok. One of the reasons it's interesting is I'm doing a whole monologue on this, which is like, how exactly do they turn around, which is a failing business on almost every metric, from staffing, advertising. The way that they bet their future was just fundamentally wrong. And that's part of the reason why they ended up having to sell to Elon. And even at $44 billion, it was a dramatically overpriced company. At its current valuation of what it should have been worth, it's something like 25 billion, which is like an average week or whatever at Facebook. So how exactly does that happen? So what they're pointing and looking to is a couple of things. Number one is it doesn't take a genius to figure out that TikTok is at a very precarious ground here in the US. They really only have a couple of options, which we've talked about previously. Number one, they could get outright banned, which I think is increasingly on the table, although I don't think the Biden administration wants to antagonize young voters. Two, this is the more interesting one to me, as a forced sale. Basically, we're like, look, it is not possible to have this company with this amount of access to America's data, having been used specifically for spyware purposes, to be in the hands of the Chinese government. So you've got to sell it. The issue is, and I didn't know this, you'll love this, part of the reason why the Trump administration's forced sale didn't work out is that U.S. investors in ByteDance would have had standing to sue in a forced sale if they did not if they didn't decide that it was a fair profit that they were making. So they're effectively weaponizing American securities laws against their own government and for a national security concern.
Classic.
It's actually easier to ban it than it is to force them to sell.
Interesting.
Which is hilarious given the way that our legal
interesting.
jurisprudence system. I didn't even know this. A couple of my legal friends were telling me. The third option, which is the least desirable option in my opinion, is that they would reach some fake deal where they're like, well, all the data has to be held by Americans and a fake independent review board will look at it. It's all bullshit. Like,
right.
Look, if a Chinese company owns it, it's over. They have access to it, and the CCP can have control. It does not take a genius to figure out that one of those three options is on the table. It is going to have some impact, some, we don't know, on TikTok. So what's the closest analogous technology? It was Vine. And a lot of people have been saying for a while, Vine was not first to market necessarily in the format, but it was a thriving platform that was really taking off and had somewhat of a cultural imprint at the moment.
Definitely.
From what I read, though, part of the issue, though, and let's put this next part up there on the screen. Elon actually had a Twitter poll where he's like, should I bring back Vine or not? 70% voted yes. Mr. Beast replied, said, if you did that and actually competed with TikTok, that'd be hilarious. And he said, what could we do to make it better than TikTok? So I think that Elon and the team over there are really thinking about what the future of that short form media content could be. I do think it is worth, though, revisiting before we all get our hopes up. Because I actually did think Vine was cool. Personally, I'm just not like a big consumer of that type of content, like that type of content. But it's worth saying, like, okay, what went wrong here? let's put this up there. Twitter shuttered the company in 2016 after buying it in 2012. The reason why is that they decided that short form content like that was not the future. And get this, that Periscope and live streaming would be their major bet in video. Now, I'm not saying Periscope is bad, but I think we all know how that worked out.
How consequential has that been?
Several years ago. There's a couple of options, though, which is like, what happened? In 2012, Vine was one of the #1 apps on the iTunes App Store after only 6 months. They had 200 million active users. However, this is part of the issue. A lot of Vine stars were not staying on the platform. What they point to is that Vine stars were getting big on Vine, but then they were going to Instagram, Snapchat, and YouTube to make it big. And I kind of remember some of the Vine creators that I used to follow. And I was like, I wonder why that is. There's a couple of things going on, which is that first and foremost, it was just really early. Second, that was also the age when all these platforms, this is like awakening and censorship and all that, they were just throwing money at anybody who had a big presence. So Instagram was reaching out to people on Vine, be like, hey, why don't you just come and post it here? In a lot of ways, Instagram was just straight up copying a lot of content, right? They stole Snapchat stories. They were made it so the short-form video were gonna get on there. Vine didn't have a particularly unique value add, but in a lot of ways, given the way that everything has kind of, Instagram creators, I'm not saying that they don't, most people are like platform first these days. There's very few who are like genuinely omni. I think that Vine, their issue was that they just didn't have the recommendation algorithm. Like they had the content down, but they didn't have the algorithm of really knowing you. So they would have to nail that to become a true TikTok competitor. And I think that's the hardest part.
Well, and then, you're just straight up copying TikTok. That's the thing is like, we talk about all these social media platforms and, our tech titans, these are these great innovators. Every single one of them right now, all they're doing is trying to copy TikTok. That's the whole thing, like YouTube Shorts and Instagram and Facebook, and all of them, and Twitter now is like, okay, let's do our own TikTok version. And I do think that it's the thing that made TikTok really work and really explode was that recommendation algorithm. I think with Vine too, my understanding at the time is like they had trouble monetizing it. That was part of the issue as well. And I don't know, for creators, it may not have been. It was apparently not as lucrative as other platforms as well.
TikTok's not either. That's the thing. They got the fake TikTok.
That is the weird thing.
You don't make a lot of money.
Right. And I do wonder if they would be vulnerable to the same thing ultimately, because we saw in our little dabbling on TikTok, it's actually not hard to get a lot of views because of the recommendation algorithm, but it's only the top stars who get sponsorship deals and those sorts of things. You have to almost go outside of the platform in order to monetize whatever content you're creating on the platform. So Vine would suffer from that same issue. So I don't know. Again, the way I looked at it was just like, oh, how surprising. Twitter's now going to also copy TikTok, just like every other social media platform ultimately.
I'd be fine with it look, I would much rather have an American company doing it. That being said, I know that there are
the problem is, you know how this goes. Like, once a thing gets established and that's the place that you go for short.
I know.
Like my daughter, who was, like I said, my oldest, she was really into Vine when she was little. There were some creators on there that were super funny and silly, and she loved their content. She watched them all the time. Vine goes away. Well, she's a teenager now, and she's on TikTok, and she's happy with TikTok. She finds TikTok, she really enjoys it. She gets served content that she finds really hilarious. She's always sending me little videos or sending other people little videos. I don't see that she has a sense of like, oh, I should go over here now. So TikTok has already established such a large footprint. I think it would take something like completely banning it for people to be forced to move into another zone.
Banned it in India. They had competitors within 2 weeks, and they've got a thriving environment. Look, I agree with you. I've tried to use some of the TikTok alternatives. They're terrible. I remember there was one like Triller or something like that. Even Reels. Again, the format's not for me. I know that some people use it, but I just don't think it's particularly all that great. As I get it from my friends who love TikTok, the algorithm is everything. Unless you can replicate that, I don't think it's possible.
Well, even if you do replicate that, again, you have to not just make something as good as TikTok. You have to give people an actual affirmative reason why they would decide to leave this little social media home where they're comfortable and happy and go somewhere else.
Yeah, true.
And it's not clear to me what that proposition would be. We see this with like all the free speech platforms that have popped through social or whatever. Like, people are on social media platforms because that's where everybody is. They get comfortable in a certain ecosystem, and they understand how it works, and they've got followers, they've got people who they are following, creators that they like, and whatever. It takes something really significant to get people to move over. So, like I said, I think it takes more than just like sort of copying what TikTok is doing. You got to come up with something that is truly new and different and provide something to your audience base or your user base that doesn't already exist. And I mean, maybe they'll come up with something, but that is certainly not laid out in these pieces here.
Definitely. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next part. This is really interesting and potentially earth-shattering in terms of its impact on American society. Let's put this up there on the screen. So the Supreme Court, the conservative majority there, signaling major skepticism of race-conscious college admissions. So what happened yesterday, which is that at issue are these two policies, Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, that permit their admissions offices to weigh the race of applicants as one of many factors that will help decide who is being accepted. Depending on the scope of the court's ruling, and this is important, they could rule in many different ways. The outcome could have impact on workplace and other long-standing, quote, anti-discrimination law. And I want to be very clear, which is that how exactly they rule and the scope through which could restrict it completely to admissions. This is why we're even spending any time covering it. Or it could go all the way out into the way that diversity practices work, even at a quote unquote private company. Anyway, so there were over 5 hours of arguments. I was even considering doing a monologue, but the arguments weren't wrapping up. And I was like, I can't do it without, I was like, I can't do a whole monologue on this until it's actually done. Luckily, it ended last night. What we effectively noted is that the conservatives on the bench were talking about the 2003 precedent that does permit the use of race in college admissions that had urged policies should not be in place indefinitely. So what we should remember is that in that 2003 case, effectively the court was like, okay, you can keep in mind race. You cannot use points-based admissions. That's just not on the table. But to say that you can't keep it in mind at all is not going to happen. That said, you need to come up with a system so that you don't rely on this indefinitely.
Yeah.
And what I found really interesting in the court and a lot of the arguments that I was looking at is that none of the universities, neither Harvard nor the University of North Carolina, could actually spell out a time frame as to when it was going to be appropriate or not.
Yeah, but
I feel like
go
ahead.
That's kind of fair.
No,
that's like being like, on this date in 2032, we will have total racial justice. We'll have solved racism. So, I mean, it's kind of fair to be like, I don't know, we're not there yet, but hopefully at some point in the future we get to that.
I don't even disagree, but I was looking at it and I was like, that just part to me makes the whole like idea of the 03 case being like, yeah, but it eventually has to end just even more patently ridiculous because you could probably always make an argument. So we're like, okay, so then we should consider it on what is the actual impact. This goes to the Harvard University portion of which we've covered now for several years, which is that Harvard from the lawsuit and the court rulings and all that have come out, it has been shown repeatedly that it is highly discriminatory against Asian American students by giving them lower scores for, quote, personal attributes.
I mean, some of the stuff that came out.
Yeah. It's outrageous.
I don't think there's any denying that whatever you think of affirmative action, that the current system has discriminated against Asian Americans in a very perverse way.
Right. And because they'll be like, well, they literally can show that you can have the same test scores, you can have the same basically attributes on every single thing. And then on the personal section, they're getting rated dramatically lower.
It's all these very like racist tropes of like, doesn't show leadership
not
qualities.
Social.
It's like, oh, this is bad. This is really bad.
Anyway, so the point is that in that 2003 case, they set that 25-year timeline, but they didn't necessarily cap themselves on when race-conscious admissions were coming up. This, of course, would take place 2022 and is based really on both anti-discrimination practices as in the way that affirmative action is being used against Asian Americans, but also just in general on the idea of race consciousness. And the reason I thought it was important is not only in terms of the scope of American society, but really politically. This is one of the great disconnects. Krystal, you did a fantastic monologue on this a while back over at Rising, between really elites and the rest of the public. Affirmative action is perhaps one of the most single unpopular positions that exists in the United States. Was defeated in the state of California on a ballot level in 2020. And yet, you have the Biden administration that went to bat for it, actually, at the court. The U.S. Solicitor General saying that it was a national security imperative to keep it. Let's take a listen.
That truth is vitally important to our nation's military. Our armed forces know from hard experience that when we do not have a diverse officer corps that is broadly reflective of a diverse fighting force, our strength and cohesion and military readiness suffer. So it is a critical national security imperative to attain diversity within the officer corps. And at present, it's not possible to achieve that diversity without race-conscious admissions, including at the nation's service academies. The military experience confirms what this court recognized in Grutter, that in a society where race unfortunately still matters in countless ways, achieving diversity can sometimes require conscious acts by our leading educational institutions.
So that was the U.S. Solicitor General, effectively like the chief litigator on behalf of the United States, making it, of course, in the purview of what they have, which is the U.S. service academies. Because, as we said, if it does impact higher education, even at a private university like Harvard, it would, of course, also apply to the service academies. Let's consider it, though, in the public context. Put this up there on the screen. Most Americans actually say that colleges and universities should not consider applicants' race in order to further student body diversity in education. So U.S. adult citizens, 23% yes, 23% not sure. A majority, 54%, say no. Even amongst Democrats, Krystal, only 40% say yes. 26% say not sure. 34% say no. Independents, 17% yes, 28% not sure, 55% no. Republicans, overwhelming majority, say no. I also think it's important to note, if you ask Black Americans, only 36% say yes, 33% say not sure, and 33% say no. The same fits with quote-unquote Hispanic, whatever that means. And then amongst white Americans, 16% say yes, and 64% say no.
I would love to see the class breakdown.
Of course, and that's what I was about to get to.
I would love to see the class breakdown.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a lot to say about this because I think the reason why it's so unpopular is because it really rubs up against the notion that Americans want to strive for a colorblind society. And so there is this real rub there. I mean, the issue that I always have talking about affirmative action and why it's such sort of tricky ground for me personally is I sort of feel like I disagree with everyone on it. There's a lot of presumptions behind the policy and the debate on affirmative action that I just don't accept and don't agree with. The whole debate takes as fact the idea that we have a meritocracy, that the meritocracy is generally functioning, that the thing we should be striving for is to perfect that meritocracy, rather than, you know, my goal as a leftist, which is to make sure that everyone is able to succeed. I also think, like I said, Asian Americans are getting screwed by this policy. There's just no denying that. And I think that's something that people who are big proponents of this policy really have to grapple with and really have struggled to grapple with. That's number one. Number two, I don't agree with the arguments that are being put forth by the conservatives on the court, which is basically like, mission accomplished, colorblind society done, don't need this policy anymore. And we shouldn't pretend that the arguments that were being offered on the court, which is why I don't even spend a lot of time, like I read through the gist of what they were saying, but ultimately this is an ideological debate. It has very little to do with what their actual interpretation of the Constitution is. The 6 conservatives on the court, they don't like affirmative action. They're gonna find a way to strike it down, regardless of the arguments that are being made to them and whether they're persuaded on the constitutionality of it or whatever. And the liberals are, you know, on the other side. This is an ideological debate. The Supreme Court is partisan. We should keep all of that in mind as well. So those are some of my thoughts. But the other thing that I always come back to is like, what is your goal? What is your goal with this policy? If the only option on the table for me is let's diversify the elite class.
Which is what this is.
This policy is effective.
Yeah, that's true.
And you know what? I would rather, if that is my only option, is have a non-diverse elite class, and I'm just talking about racial diversity here, or have a diverse, racially diverse elite class, then I will take the diverse elite class. Okay, if that's my only option on the table. However, if your goal is actually to reduce the racial wealth gap, we know from history, which is a goal that I personally care a lot more about than I care about the, you know, technical racial diversity of the elite class. we know from history that this policy does not do that. That in fact, the policies that have been most effective throughout our history to help to close the racial wealth gap, which we still have a very long way to go on, are universal policies that lift the floor for everyone. Things like lifting the minimum wage, things like making sure that Social Security and living wage benefits apply to across all job categories, and we don't carve out, the job categories that are disproportionately filled by Black and brown people. So if that's your goal, and when you layer on top of that how much we know this policy is really unpopular, there's also a pragmatism here of we shouldn't assume that we can use our political capital to do absolutely everything. We should invest our political capital in the policies that are going to have the largest effect at achieving ultimately our goals. And I think we have one other piece from David Shore on the last element here.
Fascinating, actually.
That if you track, these are all of the different sort of Democratic aligned policies. Affirmative action is one of the least popular. So again, it has been beneficial primarily for middle and upper middle class minorities to, get into college and to ascend into the elite class. I don't think that's a bad thing. I do think diversity is an important value. But it goes back to the question of what are you really trying to accomplish and what are the policies that will most help you effectuate that goal that have broad public support. The last thing I will say on this, because I cannot leave this out, is that it is kind of a screwed up world where this gets struck down, but you still have legacy admissions, which are affirmative action for rich white people.
Well, actually,
and it's disgraceful that is something that goes on and is so important, especially at our elite universities.
It's actually interesting that this could have an impact on legacy admissions as well. I want to concur with almost everything that you said. And I think one of the most impactful pieces that ever been had on me was written by the socialist Matt Bruenig about the racial wealth gap. And I think people should know this. The vast majority of the racial wealth gap in the United States is about the top 2 deciles of blacks and whites, as in, when everyone's black wealth and white wealth, that's between the top 20% in both groups, as in the top 20% of white people are much richer than the top 20% of rich black people. If you look at the median income of white earners and black earners, there is a gap, but it's not even close to what the gap is of what, we're looking at, which gets directly to your point, which is that, do you want a society where the NASDAQ remains the same, but there is a black person who's on the board of the directors? Or do you want a society where NASDAQ companies chase policies which are better for their workers and for the median American? And in general, my problem and why my politics are the way they are was coming to the Northeast and seeing the way that elite liberals talk about so many of these issues and realize this is all just a game for all of you. As in, you want to protect whatever this little slice is and diversify this very small slice of the economy, the elite, the electorate, and not talk about anything that impacts any of the people I grew up with or even grew up around. It's they're used as pawns. And I think that generally is why I get so annoyed by it and why I like pointing to the political popularity, as you said. If you can't get affirmative action passed on the ballot in California, how are you going to defend it as the national law of the land, or at the very least as allowing it in some of our, not just major institutions in government,
listen,
military,
for me,
all across the workplace.
The polling is not in and of itself determinative. I support other policies that don't poll well because I think they're the right policy, and you should be willing to argue for that. But when you couple that with the fact that this really doesn't, to me, help to deal with what should be the core goal, which is closing the racial wealth gap, and you're really antagonizing a majority of the public with this policy, then it gets to the question of, okay, is this really ultimately worth it? And I can imagine situations where, I'm generally a big supporter of universal policies, as you guys know, Medicare for all, living wage, unions for all. I think those are the best ways. And again, the track record bears it out to not only support the entire working class, but specifically those policies are most beneficial for Black and brown people who are disproportionately impoverished and in low wage jobs and, struggling at that end of the economy. So in general, I think those are the best policies. Can I imagine a policy that would be sort of specific to, to racial discrimination? 100%, absolutely. I don't think we should put that off the table whatsoever. But I do want to emphasize again, the part of this that, I really do chafe at from conservatives is their view is basically like meritocracy, already good to go, no racial discrimination, everybody can compete, everybody can make it, so we don't need to do anything about this. And I don't agree with that either. I just think that we can aspire to more than diversifying our elite class, and ultimately that's, the thrust of my politics and where I like to spend my time.
I think we totally agree on that one.
All right, so guys, the story you've all been waiting for. More updates on that horrific hammer attack on Paul Pelosi. We did have federal charges filed yesterday by the Department of Justice. Let's put this up on the screen. And we got a lot more information because we got information from David DePape. Is that how you say his name? Himself.
DePape.
We have some summarized information from his own interview here. In any case, he was charged with assault, attempted kidnapping, following breaking and entering of the Pelosi residence. Paul Pelosi described to police he'd been asleep. DePape, who we'd never seen before, entered his bedroom and was saying, "Where's Nancy?" looking for Nancy Pelosi. According to the complaint, minutes after the 911 call, 2 police officers responded to the Pelosi residence. They saw Paul Pelosi and DePape struggling over a hammer. This is kind of messed up too. Officers told the men to drop the hammer. DePape then allegedly gained control of the hammer and swung it, striking Pelosi in the head. So it's kind of horrific that it's actually when the police officers are on the scene, and they're saying drop the hammer, and they're unable to stop the worst of this attack happens. I mean, they're there and witness it. Officers immediately restrained DePape while Pelosi appeared to be unconscious on the ground. As set forth in the complaint, once DePape was restrained, officers secured roll of tape, white rope, another hammer, a pair of rubber and cloth gloves, zip ties from the crime scene, where officers also observed a broken glass door to the back porch, which was apparently how he gained entry. Let's put this next piece up on the screen. So these are some of the details that really go about, yesterday we talked about some of the conspiracy, some of the questions and the original details of what came out. Well, DePape himself is doing a lot to dispel some of the conflicting information and some of the erroneous details that were initially reported. So he says he broke into the house through a glass door. It was a difficult task. It required the use of the hammer. He said Pelosi was in bed, appeared surprised by DePape. He told Pelosi to wake up. He told Pelosi he was looking for Nancy. Pelosi then responded that she was not present and asked how they could resolve the situation. There's more as well in terms of a motive, which was another question mark. I mean, he makes it pretty clear. He wanted to hold Nancy Pelosi hostage. He viewed Nancy as the, quote, leader of the pack of lies told by the Democratic Party. His goal was to question Nancy Pelosi. He expected her to not give the answers that he wanted, and then he was going to break her kneecaps, that was the plan, so that she would have to be wheeled into Congress to serve as a message to the other Democrats that he also didn't like and, ultimately wanted to target. In addition, there was the question of, was there a third person? Because there was an initial report to that effect, which had then been retracted. DePape says directly, they went downstairs to the front door, so himself and Paul Pelosi. Police arrived and knocked on the door, and Paul Pelosi ran over and opened it, not an unidentified third person. So that is what is being reported here, that the alleged assailant himself, is telling the authorities.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the definitive word from Mr. DePape. That's why I actually thought it was worthwhile, because I was like, okay, well, this is from the man himself, like from an interview.
He's like, I was looking for Nancy. I wanted to hold her hostage. That's what the zip ties were for. Here's how I gained entry. Here's who answered the door. No, there was no one else there. I wanted to break her kneecap. So pretty clear at this point.
Only question I still have is about security, which is that if he says that he went downstairs to the front door, broke the slide door open. As I said, I mean, I guess we do just have to believe that they had no shatter alarm or anything on their house, which is kind of crazy. Whenever
wild.
You're in the third in line to the presidency, you're in a $6 million mansion in one of the most dangerous cities in the United States with high crime. Like, again, I don't live in that dangerous of an area, and if you break my window, it's gonna call 911. So I'm like, I don't really understand how they don't have that policy. Also, allegedly, Paul Pelosi was asleep, right? According to DePape, whenever he was in his bed. And DePape, this is so creepy. Imagine waking up to
oh my God,
in your house. I would freak.
Lunatic with a hammer.
That's a whole other discussion about what you should also perhaps have on your bedside table. But anyway, the point being that this was very strange to me in how he was able to gain access. And if anything, if you are in any somewhat of a prominent position, or even if you just live in a dangerous area, like this is a good reminder to not put yourself in a position where anything like this is even possible.
Yeah.
I do think, honestly, I do really think, just like after Gabby Giffords, I think the Capitol Police needs to come out and say what they're going to do for everybody else who's in the line of succession and elsewhere to make sure that this doesn't happen. Because, I mean, Steve Scalise, you know, he's still suffering after he got shot. But it's not just him. Kevin McCarthy, McConnell, Elaine Chao, all these folks.
It also shows you, like, I mean, Pelosi herself has protection.
Yeah.
So if she had been home,
yeah, then it would have been
there
fine.
would have been Secret Service protection there. So it shows you, I guess, the family members need security as well. I mean, it is a sad state of affairs that we're living in, but this is the reality. Is you have, you know, a lot of extreme political rhetoric, a lot of extreme conspiracy theories, and then you have people who are, you know, mentally unwell, who this guy was talking about, he thought he was a patriot, you know? Right. He really thought he was doing the right thing, and he was holding the lying Democrats to account. And that's, I mean, obviously, like, deranged individual, then fueled by this extreme, like, political rhetoric. And again, just to be clear, my position on this isn't like the liberal position. Well, that's why we must have censorship, and that's why we must, you know. Yeah. I mean, this is why, and you can never say like what would have deterred this one particular attacker. But in general, this is why you need to have a functioning democracy where people feel like their votes and their voices are heard, where they feel like they have an opportunity and a chance for themselves and their family members to succeed. And, you know, more specifically to this case, where they're able to get mental health treatment and addiction treatment, and where we don't have, you know, so many people who are walking around with untreated mental illness, creating to, you know, exacerbating chaotic situations.
The last wrinkle, let's put this up there on the screen, is apparently Mr. DePape was a longtime U.S. visa overstay and was here illegally. So I'm sure that
we got to crack down on those Canadians coming across the border, Saagar.
I don't disagree with you. I think they should get the hell out of here. It's their problem. If you guys have free healthcare, why don't you like it so much? It's too cold, maybe. That's a whole other
The
discussion.
northwestern part of Canada is not that cold. It's actually very
I've
lovely.
only been to I've been to Quebec, a beautiful city, by the way. Great food, except for poutine, which is disgusting. BC is actually very beautiful. I've never been to Calgary. Beautiful. I think I would like to go. From what I've heard, that's like my vibe.
I've been to Calgary. Calgary's okay.
I don't know. My parents.
I like BC more. I went to Banff National Park.
I've never been there.
That's beautiful. Yeah. You would like that.
When I was in Glacier, everybody was like, "Oh, well, if you go right across the border, you know, they have the Canadian part of Glacier."
Yeah,
like, okay.
Banff is amazing. But it is like, you said Glacier was really crowded. I mean, Banff is the same deal. It's like very touristy, which kind of to me takes away from it. But it is definitely beautiful. I'm a Canada fan. I like it.
It's all right. It's too cold for me. My dad got his PhD in Canada, to be clear. Like, he loved it there.
All right, Saagar, what are you looking at?
Well, Elon's purchase of Twitter has me thinking a lot about the state of social media and the internet. I'm in a strange position. I literally owe my entire livelihood to the internet. Yet, I don't think I've ever been less happy with the internet. My own personal usage is at an all-time low. My reliance on it is at an all-time high. It's something obviously I and many others need to square with our modern online economy, but it's also one that has us asking a lot of big questions. What does a reset might look like, and what are some potential benefits to it? A lot of this is sparked by a discussion Krystal and I had yesterday about verification, with The Verge reporting that Musk is planning to charge $20 a month to verified users who want to remain so on the platform. The theory behind it is a few things. Number one is something Musk has been obsessed with, eliminating bots on the platform and verifying that there's a real person behind the keyboard. Number two, though, seems more interesting, trying to fulfill his initial quota of making nearly half of Twitter's revenue come from subscriptions alone. I personally love that idea, especially as co-head of a subscription business like Breaking Points. What we know here well is that the more reliant that you are on paying subscribers, the less you are influenced by market trends. We have amazing premium subscribers, so if YouTube censors one of our videos, or if they play games with the algorithm, or if Apple Podcasts decides tomorrow to take us off, not only will we not starve, but the business would be fine. It's telling, as Krystal said yesterday, that one of the very first things Elon did as CEO of Twitter was post a missive to Twitter advertisers asking them to remain calm and patient, while also noting that no changes to content moderation were coming. That came after this report from the Wall Street Journal and Business Insider that major advertisers on Twitter were considering pulling all their ads off the platform if Trump's accounts were restored. And it highlights a central conundrum that any ad-supported business faces. The users are not the customers. It's the people who actually pay. If the people who pay are united in an ideology that is contrary to the benefit of the users, or in this case of the American body politic, then that's a structural problem. For context, Twitter is simply not a very good advertising business. Consider this. In 2021, it earned $4.5 billion from selling ads on the platform, which represented 89% of the company's total revenue. Put that up against Facebook or Google, which made a respective $117 billion or $250 billion in the same time period. We're talking about a platform which is simply a fraction of that. Or consider its daily users. Twitter, for all of its cultural cachet, has only 300 million daily active users. That's if you believe them on how many bots are on the platform. Facebook has 1.9 billion. Google has even more, with literally 8.5 billion searches per day on the platform. We essentially have a situation where Twitter has the same cultural cachet as these giants, but with a fraction of its user base and its revenue. That is why Twitter was losing money. In fact, in only 2 years of the company history did they ever make a profit. After those years, Wall Street kept pressing them for growth, and they were totally unable to deliver, both on users and by definition of revenue. As much as I believe in Elon as an entrepreneur, I think the fundamental problem is that Twitter is simply not a good business, especially for ads. But clearly, it does add value. When you put it up against Facebook or Google, it is arguably even more influential at an elite level. The discussion and the activity which is generated on Twitter potentially impacts hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of our entire economy. The problem is that none of that value is being currently captured by the company. It's dispersed. And so that's why I think charging for verification actually misses the mark. To me, it's quite simple. The value of Twitter is both to the users who can get instantaneous access to information, opinions, and discussions, but also to the people who are wielding that influence. It's the latter group, enmeshed in the discourse, for lack of a better word, that can't lose that. Not only is it part of their identity, but it is literally part of their business. So if that's the case, simply charging them for it, the more that I think about it, the more I think that people should be charged per follower count. And to be clear, I actually think it should be free for the vast majority of users. Dollars should not even come into play until you hit like 25,000 followers. The exact numbers of users with that many followers is not publicly available. But considering that the average person has only 700 followers, we can surmise it's not that many people. But the point is that those larger accounts, let's take one like mine, it has approximately 378,000 as of this writing, should have to pay for the ability to engage with the people who follow me. Why? Because presumably I am getting more of a value for my ability to communicate with my audience than whatever the prospective fee that Twitter would charge me. And as I said in my original tweet on the subject, the price should be tiered, especially weighted to making major enterprise brands pay a lot of money. Consider this. Right now, people can tweet at American Airlines or some other brand about a problem they are experiencing. That brand can then reply in real time, message them, and solve their problem for them via Twitter DM, all on the Twitter platform. But at the same time, American Airlines does not have to pay anything to Twitter for that privilege. Even though, if you were to design a customer service platform, you probably could not create a better one than that. And if you presented it in that way from its inception, of course the companies would pay. At a basic level, consider, Krystal and I, as a small business, have to pay all kinds of fees to run it, including to MailChimp to send emails, communicate with our customers, Zapier to ensure that our mailing list is operable, podcast hosting platforms to publish our episodes, and many more. All the fees I listed are tiered. The bigger your list or audience, the more that you pay. Presumably, the value because you're deriving is more than what you're paying. And finally, is a real question. Why do I even care? I'll tell you why. Because I was made on Twitter. It's the first place I ever got to engage in discussions and debates, and I was a lot younger, and I cared a lot about. As a junior reporter, it gave me a space to publish my work, to get noticed, to distribute it. There's zero way I'd be here without it. I want it to both be better and to actually become a viable business, not just a vanity play for Elon Musk. Bringing profitability and aligning incentives properly drive us away from the internet that we're all living in right now, where we all need it, but we don't really like it. And if you take away anything from this, at least remember this. If you are using something for free online, you are not the customer, you are the product. And Krystal, I mean, I did this, A, because I hope it influences the discussion on whatever's going on with Elon, but I think it's important to like rethink some of these questions around the internet. This stuff, it's free, but it's not really free. And I think we've all found that out really a hard way in what, the 2016 onward?
Yeah. I mean, it's very tangled for me because to me, the one thing that's really clear is, look, my overall view is that these things should be regulated like public utilities. There should be democratic accountability. We all should own it. We shouldn't be subject to the whims of a billionaire. And I don't really think that there's a way to solve this problem by reconfiguring the revenues without having that sort of democratic accountability. But the fact that it's a public company makes it even more difficult because then, okay, let's say that you do diversify. Let's say you do the model you're suggesting, some sort of subscription fee for users, especially large users. You're still going to have ads. And you're still going to have a shareholder imperative to maximize the amount of ad
right now
dollars.
it is private, too. He might take it public.
Yeah.
He took it private, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Anyway,
so that to me is like first step because you can't have the shareholder imperative to, you know, demand that, okay, we have to have the advertisers and no matter what, we have to have the return. I just think that if you have profit at the center of this thing, it ultimately doesn't work. I can also see some problems with, you know, the analogy isn't exactly right to our business because while we derive benefits from being on Twitter, we also are creators on Twitter. So it's not a one-way street.
True.
So if you're making your creators pay to be on I mean, most of these platforms pay the creators to be on the platforms.
Right.
So if you're then forcing the creators to pay to be there, you will have some percentage that's just like, no, not going to do it.
They could.
And then Twitter, I mean, you are definitionally going to have some percentage that's like, no, not doing that. And then Twitter, you know, over time erodes into a less robust, less interesting product ultimately. So I'm not sure it's the remedy that ultimately, you know, will save the business, even though I agree with you that, you know, the fundamental problem with social media is the fact that the user is not the, you know, you're not the customer. That's not who these platforms are catering to ultimately. It's part of what makes it a bad experience, the fact that you're being packaged and sold to advertisers. Like, that's what makes this all really ugly and makes the landscape sort of gross and makes you feel like, okay, I'm not really enjoying my experience here. Well, you're not really meant to enjoy the experience. That's not the point. So having some sort of subscription-based revenue, it can help to deal with that problem, but I think it's a little bit trickier because I can also see how, you know, how it could get into kind of a death spiral where fewer people then are on the platform creating interesting content. That leads to fewer users engaging and down and down and down you go.
The reason why I think it's a bit different is that Instagram ads actually do work. You know, it's like whenever you're the creator and you get paid to be there, it's presumably because your ads work. I mean, Google ads are tremendously effective, like YouTube ads that we create. Twitter ads, we have learned, are terrible. They don't really actually just don't work. They're not, you know, they even did internal studies on their promotional campaigns. They don't do anything. Like, as we've also found out, half of advertising budgets are just spent because they can be. It's like Coca-Cola is like, we got $2 billion to spend, and their ad guys go out and just, you know, dish it out. And then they're like, yeah, it worked. See, we sold X amount of product. Nobody knows what ads are actually effective. I had to put money on it. I think Facebook and Google are the best at it, but outside of that, it's all fake. Like cable news advertising.
Yeah.
Why does anybody advertise there? I mean, maybe it works. There's no actual a lot of data.
I mean, they are getting like, yeah, it might not be that effective ultimately, but they are getting a lot of revenue from ad dollars.
Certainly.
It would be a lot to make up. And, you know, even though I think the current social media model of being ad-based really sucks, we also haven't seen an example where you have the type of model that you're talking about and it works. So, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, like, the consumers at the beginning of this age sort of chose that, all right, we'd rather have it be free and just be like subject to your terrible corporate surveillance and ad spamming and all of that, than have to pay. And also, the more that you gatekeep and have paywalls, the fewer people you're going to have on the platform and the less useful it is, because ultimately the big value of social media is these massive network effects, which is why they're kind of natural monopolies, really. So why the idea of like, oh, let's break them up, that also doesn't make any sense, especially for an entity like Twitter. It's why, really, I mean, in my view, I just come back to, you can't have profit as the end-all be-all in these companies. They need to be regulated like public utilities because they're natural monopolies and because the benefit of them comes from it being a free and open digital town square. And it doesn't really work out to have it be that, like, you know, you pay to have a larger voice, basically.
It's a tough one, no matter.
It's a tangly one. I will give you that.
What do you want to take a look at?
I know you're all very excited this morning because today is the big debut of CNN's new morning show. It's called CNN This Morning, the revamped morning show under new network boss Chris Licht. Features hosts Poppy Harlow, Caitlin Collins, and Don Lemon. The show actually seems to be pretty emblematic of the direction that Licht is taking the network in overall. It represents less of a new vision or new direction for CNN, more of a shuffling of the chairs. You might say those are deck chairs. You might say they're on the Titanic. As Licht reveals planned layoffs, cutbacks, and a lack of ambition in new programming, he's really signaling that CNN is not going to try to compete in the new media cord-cutting era. Instead, the network is going to cut costs, hunker down, try to hold on to what they've got for as long as they possibly can. To be honest, might be the best play that they can really make, a managed decline that will keep the network chugging along in diminished form for years to come. So if the future under Jeff Zucker, the previous boss, was sort of absurd and ridiculous, under Chris Licht, there's a brutal realism that basically there is no future. As Breaking Point's viewers will recall, Zucker put all his eggs into CNN Plus, spent more than $300 million on the doom streaming effort, believing this would be CNN's big play for the new era. Zucker, too, recognized that the cable news business was a dinosaur with a business model built for a different time, but he believed he could remake it to match the moment. Apparently didn't realize that streaming really only works if you have content and talent that people actually want to pay to consume. You can't just take the same old programming, make it more cringe, and stuff it into a streaming service and think that that is going to work out. No, the kids are not going to pay to see more of Chris Wallace. Licht's approach has been to make a few moves that give the appearance of a revitalization while hunkering down for the storm. His first big move was to unceremoniously kill the flashy CNN Plus debacle that Zucker had been betting the entire network on. But now we're getting more insight into how specifically Licht views the business and CNN's future. In an interview with CNBC, Licht was clear that significant layoffs were coming to, quote, right-size the network. Overall, more than 1,000 jobs are set to be eliminated at Warner Brothers Discovery before the end of the year. Like the new morning show, programming changes have just entailed shuffling existing talent around rather than making any real play for any big new stars. Licht has also announced that the network will cease buying original content and documentaries, so series like Anthony Bourdain Parts Unknown or Kamau Bell's United Shades of America, documentaries like RBG, or the currently running series that's called The Murdoch's Empire of Influence. That's all going away. It's not that the content was unpopular. Some of it actually was quite successful. According to Licht, it's just too expensive for them to continue to acquire. This year, the network is going to earn less than $1 billion. That's the first time that they'll hit that mark since the Trump era. Put it all together, and you get a picture of a business trying to get lean for very hard times, betting on slowing the bleed rather than positioning for new growth plays and new expansion. Now, I don't mean to pick on just CNN here. There's just been the most reporting on the future of that network after the turmoil of the Cuomo affair, the abrupt departure of Zucker, and so many other things that have happened there. But the truth is, all three major cable networks, they're facing basically the same landscape. They make money from ad revenue, and they make money from cable subscription fees. Both of those items are in decline since ratings are down and cord cutters are up. All three networks saw significant drops in viewership in the third quarter. CNN was down 17% year over year. Fox was down 13%. MSNBC was down 11%. This is even more notable given that we are headed into a hotly contested midterm election where the outcome is genuinely uncertain and where you've certainly got some interesting personalities to work with from a content perspective when you consider all the candidates who are involved. Of the three, Fox obviously has the largest audience and hence the largest longevity. They benefit from a conservative viewership that thinks they can more or less only get the truth from Fox, while CNN and MSNBC have to compete not only against each other, but also against every other mainstream news network. With Rachel Maddow gone, Fox also now boasts the only remaining cable news host really capable of drawing an audience that's going to show up every night, night after night as appointment viewing. That's Tucker Carlson, of course. It's telling that MSNBC, on its own path of diminished relevance and managed decline, did not even try to fill Maddow's shoes with someone who had a prayer of matching her ratings. Because in this era, anyone who could actually accomplish such an impressive feat, they'd be a fool to do it for a cable news network rather than to do it for themselves. Today, if you can actually draw an audience, you don't need to deal with the nightmare of network bureaucracy, the creativity stifling dictates, the latent censorship, and the whims of corporate bosses. You can be successful, you can have relevance, and best of all, you can have freedom all on your own. That means increasingly the only talent left at these outlets is of the sort that is skilled at climbing the ladder within a large bureaucracy and playing the inside game of networking and access, but doesn't have a prayer of generating an audience all on their own. They can only get eyeballs thanks to the muscle memory of boomers who have cable news blaring in the background as they go about their days. Now, in fairness, the number of boomer eyeballs about to increase dramatically as we hurtle into the next Trump era. He's likely to announce his presidential run fairly quickly after the midterms. But does Orange Man obsession really pack the same ratings punch that it used to? The act is kind of tired. The outrage is kind of exhausting. Nation has become used to a certain level of ambient chaos, which wears down the novelty of Trump's whole performance. Sequels are never quite as good as the original, and this time around would be Trump's third bite at the apple of running for president. Now, I don't doubt it's going to offer all three networks a temporary reprieve from their long-term trajectory of decline. It's also going to make mincemeat of Krystal's efforts to shift CNN away from all Trump all-the-time coverage, as ratings, ego, and audience expectation will push CNN right back to the same formula that they've been using since Trump came on the scene back in 2015. But even a figure as singular as Trump cannot permanently rescue an industry where the business model was built in a different era and they are unequipped to navigate the new landscape. The reality is, we are already well past the peak of the cable news era. But make no mistake about it, the remnants will hang on in relevance, elite power for a very long time. Zombies with continued destructive power. After all, elites love feeling like their own cable news appearances are a sign of their importance and their special status. But if you follow the business decisions, you can see they have already accepted their fate as diminished players. CNN's layoffs and cutbacks are really just the beginning. And you see this most clearly with CNN and MSNBC.
Yes.
They know their business model is going away. CNN made a big flashy attempt, CNN Plus, like, okay, this is how we're gonna launch into the new era. Cut that thing off at the knees. It was a disaster. MSNBC, Fox, they've tried similar efforts with less spectacularly, but also basically failures. And so now they're just kind of hunkering down.
I mean, even the morning show format, it's just like, what is this about? What is this for? What are you trying to do here? Jake Tapper.
Who is this for?
Right. I mean, and actually, if you look at their interviews, they're like, we're going to help people get up in the morning. I'm like, do people really get up in the morning and switch on CNN? Because everybody I know who does turn on morning television, they watch Morning Joe. And they're watching that not because they want to be entertained. Well, I guess some. But really, that's because they want to be in the inside club, right? Like, that's Washington's network. The rest of the market that they're trying to target, the feel-good audience, those people watch the Today Show or like Good Morning America. Good Morning America is the one that wins all of them. They basically don't do any news. They're just talking about like the next Marvel movie that's coming out.
Right.
That's fine.
It's all pop culture.
Some people like it. Be my guest. But I'm saying, like, do we really need more competition in the space? No. That's why it's just declined. They're like, well, we'll spend X money on it and just kind of hope that it continues to only go down by 10%. It's not a sustainable model.
Yeah, and again, ultimately they'll have a lot of power for a lot of years to come.
Oh yeah.
But the writing is already on the wall, and they've all essentially just basically given up on changing the trajectory. It's just like, let's cut costs. I mean, that's why you pick an Alex Wagner to go in for Rachel Maddow. It's not like, oh, we're gonna really try and win this hour. We're gonna really try and make our imprint on primetime. It's like, no, let's get someone who's like kind of affordable and like relatively reliable, and we know she can handle the position, and just kind of like move forward and see how long we can hold on to what we've got.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, we got a great guest standing by, Dr. Vinay Prasad. Let's get to it. Joining us now is Dr. Vinay Prasad. He's a professor at the University of California, San Francisco, author of a fantastic Substack, of which we'll have a link down in the description. Dr. Prasad, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Great to be back on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go and put this up there on the screen. You talked about Biden's bivalent booster blunder. Look at that alliteration there. Fantastic. I'm amazed that I was able to say it correctly. I quoted heavily from your Sensible Magazine piece and many of the other curated thoughts that you guys have, but we wanted to have you on just to break it down. As a doctor, as an MPH, somebody deeply involved in the field and epidemiology, what do you think that the problem with the current administration's policy on the bivalent booster and Omicron vaccine is for all Americans?
Yeah, so I think that the Biden administration has decided almost unilaterally to set what the regulatory standard would be for a yearly vaccine. It's not just about this year, it's about year after year after year. And what they decided was that we are going to adopt a model that's a little bit like the flu model, where we're going to see if the vaccine can generate antibodies against a sequence that we want to hit in mice. And so this vaccine did come to the U.S. market, being tested in 8 mice for Pfizer and 10 mice for Moderna, and no human beings received the vaccine before it came to the market. Part of the reason they did that was they said that there is an important rush. We got to get it out there. We want to get ahead of the season. But one of the things that has emerged is that very few people actually want this vaccine. It's got a usage of about 7% right now. And so in my mind, that kind of, there's a tension in that argument, which is that if it was so important to get, presumably people would have wanted to get it. But people don't want to get it, so presumably they want to see some better evidence. And then I think that unlike other nations, Europe has also moved forward with bivalent vaccines. But our nation is one of the few nations globally that is pursuing the same strategy in a 7-year-old as a 77-year-old. In Europe, they are targeting it for 50-year-olds and above, or in other nations, 65 and above. So we are also going after very young people. And this has naturally, I think, led to mandates in colleges. Places like Yale University, Wellesley, they are mandating the bivalent booster for their ultra low risk 20-year-old population.
Can you talk a little bit more about this 8-mouse situation? Because you hear that and you're like, that sounds crazy. Like no human trials and only 8, that doesn't seem sufficient. But as you indicated, this is similar to what they typically do with updating the flu vaccines, right? So why do you think it might be appropriate for a flu vaccine, but may not be appropriate for the updating of the COVID vaccine?
Well, as I have been talking about this issue, one of the things I think is that actually when it comes to flu, we might be able to do a better job. I mean, we're locked into a model we've been doing for 20, 30, 40 years now. We might be able to actually generate better evidence for the flu. As you know, each year, the flu shot can either be a close match or it can be a divergent match, in which case it has limited effectiveness. That's why some seasons it seems like it doesn't do much at all. We could actually try to improve that process and have it be more reliable. But when it comes to the COVID vaccine, I do think there are some salient differences. With flu, what we do is we look over in the eastern hemisphere of the world and the southern hemisphere. We try to predict what strains are going to hit the United States this winter that have not yet come to this country. With the COVID-19 vaccine, they are going back in time to a BA.4/5 parent strain. Right now, we're dealing mostly with BA.5, but there are even new variants yet to come. And they're creating the vaccine against an older virus that's already been circulating in the United States. So I think it's a little bit different than the flu shot. The other differences I see are that when it comes to the COVID-19 shot, I think we'll all agree it's more reactogenic. People have more side effects. People are more likely to be out for a day or so. It's not a big deal, but it is more in that direction. And I think when it comes to the COVID vaccine, what we really want to know is, does each additional dose lower your risk of severe disease or hospitalization? I think it's abundantly clear that no matter how many doses you get, you are going to get some COVID-19. The question is it going to be so bad you end up in the hospital, which we don't want? But if it's going to be like a cold, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to live with that. And proof of that is Rochelle Walensky herself got the shot 1 month later. She's got COVID-19.
So do you have more of, do you have a increased safety concern because of the limited nature of these trials? Or is your concern more around just the efficacy and how much sense does it really make to be having the same policy for a 7-year-old as a 70-year-old, as you said?
Yeah, I have a little bit concern in both domains, but let's talk about the safety. The biggest safety concern, of course, is myocarditis. It's mostly men 16 to 40 and mostly men, 18 to 26. That's the highest risk demographic. And everything we see suggests there's no floor to myocarditis. It's not like after so many doses, it goes to 0. The third dose is about 1 in 10,000 risk, which is very low. But 1 in 10,000 starts to matter when the risk of hospitalization is in that ballpark or maybe less frequent for, say, a 20-year-old man who's already gotten 3 doses. I mean, their risk of hospitalization is going to be really, really low from ever getting COVID. But let's talk about efficacy. I think it is really important for both this vaccine and other vaccines that when they launch a campaign to vaccinate millions of people, they have some idea about what the vaccine efficacy is, some number. To do that, you have to give it to human beings and follow them out. Now, why does that matter? If the vaccine efficacy comes back really, really low, I think it's going to be very concerning for the American people. People are going to feel like they were cheated a little bit. One clue that it might be very low is that people who have gotten the vaccine are very quickly getting COVID-19. Another clue are 2 studies that emerged, I believe one from Harvard, one from Columbia, where they administered both the old vaccine and the new vaccine to individuals. And they found that they had the same level of BA.5 antibody, suggesting that even though this is a bivalent vaccine, we're not generating anything special against BA.5. To which Peter Marks at FDA said, well, that study is just a little too small. To To which I said was, this is the guy who likes to hang his hat on 8 mice. So, you
Right.
got to really have some perspective. And then the last thing I'd say is every time you change the sequence in the virus, it is possible you get less myocarditis. It's also possible you get more myocarditis. So I think we have to be open to detecting that safety signal if it were to arise.
Right. And so, Dr. Prasad, some of the meta points that you've really convinced me on, reading your work, is that this is going to have effects on global vaccination, on American trust, and on vaccines, which have far more efficacy, science behind them, longstanding import to society. Do we see any signals yet in that data? Why are you worried about it as a corruption of like higher institution trust in the medical system?
Yeah, so I guess my bigger concern here is, of course, that vaccination, the campaigns of vaccination, particularly for measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, polio, these are vital and important global public goods. And I do worry that in response to this and maybe other actions around vaccines and COVID vaccines, that we may be sending the wrong message both within the United States and globally and undermining U.S. trust. We can talk a little bit more about U.S. trust in a second. But when it comes to vaccines, we do see a number of surveys showing a greater reluctance to vaccinate children, not just for the COVID-19 vaccine, but for other vaccines. In my mind, it's inappropriate to equate measles vaccination in children with this vaccination because I think measles is more important. We need to tell people it's more important so that if people were to choose, let's choose measles. And then, we can have the discussion about how important the COVID-19 vaccine is. When it comes to trust, I think the United States, one of the great virtues of this country has been our US FDA has been the premier regulatory agency for 40, 50 years. All the nations of the world look to our FDA, who alone review the clinical study data independently. I think we're losing that trust in a number of ways. Our vaccine regulatory bar is going down, 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 which ironically favors the companies who are making tens of billions of dollars off these products. But I'm not sure it favors the American people who need information. But our bar for other products is going down. We were talking beforehand about the Alzheimer's drug. We have a Lou Gehrig's drug that's controversial, and cancer medicines. The more you lower the regulatory hurdles, by that I mean you make it easier for the company to get their product to the market, it looks like you're very innovative. I mean, you have lots of innovation, but is that innovation actually making people live longer or live better? And I think that's the question that faces the FDA.
So you write in this piece, you say the Biden administration's entire vaccine policy seems to be interested in giving Pfizer and Moderna a perpetual market share for a yearly vaccine, but seems to have no interest in generating credible randomized control trial evidence to inform the public. As such, they fail the American people. So why would they? I mean, maybe it's an obvious question, but is it just political corruption? Like, what are the incentives in the system that would lead this or any other administration to care about more about the profitability of big pharma than about the results for the American people?
Yeah, I think this is something that you all cover very nicely on your show. I mean, the incentives, I think, are deeply skewed at the level of the highest levels of government. One incentive is the revolving door incentive, which is that I am not worried that, like some people are, that the administration making decisions is currently receiving payments from Pfizer or Moderna. I think that's very unlikely. But I do think the primary place of employment for people who leave the FDA and people who leave the administration working in healthcare may very well be in the biopharmaceutical sector. I mean, the prior commissioner of the FDA, who I like, Scott Gottlieb, he's on the Pfizer board of directors. And we've done a paper on FDA reviewers. 50% of them go to work for or consult for the biopharmaceutical industry. So I do worry it's very difficult to be a strict regulator if you know there's a 50% chance that after this job is over, which it might be over quite soon, you're going to be on the other side of the table. And I think that's a structural bias in government. I also think that this administration, they have always wanted vaccines and Paxlovid to be the answer. I mean, it's a simple answer. It allows them to feel like they're offering something to the American people. And, to some degree, that might be a motivating factor. And then finally, I think that evidence-based medicine is something, by that I mean having good evidence for making clinical decisions. It's always been under threat in biomedicine. It isn't always greed. It's sometimes true belief. It's sometimes wishful thinking. Human beings are wonderful at making ourselves believe like the next medical breakthrough is going to be a success. What is it? The distinguishing feature of man is the desire to take medicine. We really do kind of believe in these things.
That's a great quote. I
haven't heard that one before. I like it.
What's your overall structural takeaway from all of this? Is it like, is there a view for optimism? How can if anything, I think is good. People like me, many others, have taken a lot more interest in their overall health and in questioning what exactly these drugs are, what they do, what do they mean whenever they say this. Pfizer says there's a trial. Okay, how many people? What do you think outside of that? Is there any takeaways for the general population who just want to be healthier? If they want their kids to be healthier, everybody just wants to be protected.
Well, I think you're making a good point, which is that there's a takeaway, which is that as it should have always been the case, when you go to see the doctor, you have to be an empowered consumer of healthcare, which means when the doctor makes a recommendation, you have to always ask. The question I always like to tell people to ask is, that sounds great, but just for a minute, hypothetically, what if I did nothing? What would happen? And just get the doctor to talk about that. Or if you didn't use this treatment, what would be the other treatment? And why would you choose one or the other? What makes you decide? And I think those kind of questions would really empower us a lot in our day-to-day medical encounters. I think there's a second level of lessons from this is on the Biden administration itself, which is I think that their COVID-19 policy is both a medical liability and a political liability. And there's nothing about being a Democrat that says you have to be for a vaccine campaign annually in perpetuity in 7-year-olds based on mouse data. That's not part of the Democratic platform. That's the unique policy preference of the particular individuals that they are consulting with. There are other people they could consult with who have divergent views. One is Paul Offit, who is an expert in vaccine science, Cody Meissner, who's at Tufts University. I mean, they're not wedded to this group. And I think that the vaccine rollout around young children and this bivalent booster does suggest there's a disconnect between their advisors and the American people. Now, why aren't Americans rushing to get this vaccine, and why didn't they rush to get their under 5-year-old vaccinated? It's probably because they look at their child who mostly already had COVID, or they've mostly just had BA5, and they think to themselves, what's the point? I've gotten 3 shots. I've had this. I've cleared it. I feel okay. I know what it's like. I don't need this shot. And I want to say that there's actually something to that intuition, because I'm not convinced that the shot, it will benefit you, especially if you've gotten 3 doses and you had COVID. And so the American people are voting with their feet, and wisely. And so I think the administration, especially after the election, they may decide that they want to go in a different direction on COVID-19 policy, something that more Americans have buy-in to.
Well,
I would add one to the list, which is, as you really described, we got to close the revolving door, end the revolving door, shut the revolving door, however you want to say it. Get rid of the revolving door. That's the one, because whether it's this administration, the next administration, Republican, Democrat, I mean, we see a lot of these problems repeat themselves over and over again because of the endemic corruption in the system. So that has got to end for people to have more trust in these systems.
100%. Highly recommend following Dr. Prasad's work. We're going to link down in the description to his newsletter. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Great to see you.
Thank you all so much for watching. We really appreciate it. Look, we're doing election night planning. We've got some good hires that we're going to be announcing soon here. I think you'll all be very excited. All of it 100% because of you guys, of premium subscribers. Never been happier to be able to do this. We've got our election night coverage. It's going to be exciting. This is our first real ramp up for an election night. We're going to have a live stream, all of that. Premium subs, you guys will get a first dibs and email about how exactly it's all going to go down. So anyway, link down in the description. We'll have some great content for you tomorrow. And then Friday is also Counterpoints. We'll be here on Thursday as well. So stay tuned. It's going to be a fun time.
See y'all soon.